Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to outline my strong opposition to the government's Higher Education and Research Reform Amendment Bill, and I declare straight out that I had a free university education. And I would correct the member for Herbert. I haven't heard one Labor member suggest in a speech given today that university education should be completely free. Not one. And those assertions don't do this place justice. This government continues to be full of surprises, despite their assertions before the election. The Higher Education Bill confirms that this government has introduced cuts to every level of education, from childcare all the way through to postgraduate study. Combined, these decisions act to entrench inequity at all levels of education. This is done while those opposite scream at our young people, "You must earn or learn." Today's legislation closes the loop on access and equity in education and makes the ability of young people in this country to meet that demand so much harder. And, Deputy Speaker, these changes will again hit low and middle income families and risk locking young people from my community out of university. In Lalor, people of all ages want to talk about this unfair change. Families are seriously looking at their options to assess if university is possible for their children. And meanwhile, the minister cruelly quips that he isn't asking for their left kidney. No, just their future. And here we see the final nail in the coffin. With this bill, they have basically told people in Lalor to just give up. They've closed the door on opportunity. Andrea Toohey, a resident of Lalor, wrote to me this morning. She says, "Joanne, my son has been working long hours at Coles during his gap year to help support himself at uni in Ballarat next year. He may need to keep working for a long while yet. It's a shame to think his career may be totally out of reach." This bill threatens to lock people out of future prosperity. And, Deputy Speaker, the member for Herbert has left, but I would make a discriminatory difference in some of the assertions that he made. Governments may have to bring in legislation beyond an election. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a government that made promises before an election, with a plural, and are now breaking them. Despite the promises, they act to the contrary. On education, the Prime Minister said, "I want to give people this absolute assurance, no cuts to education." I can't count the number of times I've heard it repeated. 1st of September 2013, that's before the election. On universities, he said, "If we have to change it, we will consult beforehand rather than impose it unilaterally and argue about it afterwards." Well, that is clear to me that spoke to an intent. That was in February 2013. Couldn't be clearer, really. And Minister Pyne, "We want university students to make their contribution, but we're not going to raise fees." November 2013. Emphatic after the election. When interview asked why not raise university fees, Minister Pyne said, "Because we promised we wouldn't before the election." Doubly emphatic, even after the election. And my favourite of all, Deputy Speaker, would have to be from their own Liberal Party policy document. Even when he puts things in writing, you can't rely on them. In their Real Solutions policy document, Chapter 17, page 40 and 41, they say, and I quote, "We will ensure the continuation of the current arrangements of university funding." In writing, current arrangements will continue. That's right, the document is called Real Solutions. Seems to have gone from the memories of those opposite. It was the contract they put to the Australian people. But it wasn't real. It reflects the fantasy they took to the election. Actions speak louder than words, Acting Deputy Speaker, and this bill proves once again that they were an opposition prepared to promise anything to get into power, and now they're a government that can't be trusted to keep its word. And, Deputy Speaker, what they fail to understand is the real impact the decisions they're making are having on the Australian people. What they fail to understand is that these measures are unfair. Let me go through this bill. It strips away money from universities and gives them no choice but to hit students with higher fees. This bill will see $100,000 plus university degrees. It rips $5.8 billion out of Australian universities. This bill adds to the Abbott and Hockey rap sheet of cruel, unfair cuts. $3.2 billion in cuts by taking the scalpel to help. $1.9 billion in cuts to universities by reducing government course subsidies. $202 million in cuts by indexing university grants to the CPI. $172.4 million in cuts to fund, promote and reward universities for enrolling low SES students. $173 million in cuts to the training of Australia's research students, the scientists and academics of tomorrow. $75 million cut to the Australian Research Council. $31 million cut to the National Regulator, and it abolishes the $3.5 billion Education Investment Fund. Quite a resume, but that's only the beginning. What we have now seen in addition is the full deregulation of student fees from the 1st of January 2016, which will lead to higher fees and spiralling student debt, and the increase of an interest rate burden on that student debt. The most alarming, though, is the fantasy continues opposite. Members opposite deny people will be deterred under this so-called reform. This couldn't be further from the truth. Acting Deputy Speaker, I've spent most of my adult life working in secondary schools, in my electorate, where a majority of people are what we would call traditional working class families. Most of these years I taught senior English to Year 11 and 12 students, and I was a senior years coordinator for many years. I know from personal experience what it takes to build aspiration in students, to build confidence, to get them to open their eyes to the possibilities their talents and potential can lead to. I've worked with students and their parents to look seriously at tertiary education as an option. Many of the students who left my care were the first in their families to attend university. And one of the biggest hurdles in this, Acting Deputy Speaker, was income. One of the biggest hurdles is that families would forego a contribution from a working young person to a family income. We had to overcome the idea of a reasonable debt with a payback safety net as a means to an end to a brighter future. I stand here today and I call on all of those students from my electorate and across the country from low socioeconomic circumstances that made it to university to stand and defend the next generation's ability to do so. Just this year, I heard a compelling story of a student supported by Western Chances, a not-for-profit that supports senior secondary students to get to university in the western suburbs of Melbourne. This student is now completing medicine at Monash. She detailed how hard it was to ask for money in her family when her father had been laid off work, money for books and excursions. She thought uni was out of reach, and despite her teachers having identified her talent. So here was a student clearly identified as being among the brightest and the best, who without help from a not-for-profit didn't think she'd get to university. With support, she got the books she needed and some tutoring in targeted subjects to ensure she met the tertiary requirements. That subject in her case was English. She got to uni. She's now a second-year medical student. But where would she have been now with these changes? Indeed, how is she responding to the idea that her interest rates on her help debt will increase and compound? How will these changes impact on her future life choices? Most importantly, though, would she make the same decisions today? Will next year's brightest in the same position make the same decisions? The fact of the matter is, the most deterred with this reform package will be those from electorates like mine, from working class families. What we have seen in this bill is yet another significant barrier put in place for those seeking long-term prosperity through education. I had some residents write to me this morning when I said I was going to be making a speech on higher education today. I heard from Heather Taylor, who said, "Many opportunities for students who are bright and intelligent will be lost if higher fees are brought in. Universities should be an option for all who are capable of passing the Enter scores, not just for those who can afford it." Yahida also wrote to me, a past student. "These changes are just going to put more pressure on young high school students to decide what they want to do their entire future. These things have the potential to affect someone's entire life." She wanted that read in the chamber today. She wanted those opposite to hear her voice. And Janine Luddick, who makes a really important point, "Increases in undergraduate and postgrad fees will preclude mature-age students from ever paying off their debt during their working life. Makes tertiary education only for the young and rich. Threats to funding for research students will mean the contributions of some of the nation's best minds to the development of our quality of life will be lost." Acting Deputy Speaker, these fine people deserve a government that will provide them with real opportunities. And you know, they had a government that provided them with real opportunities. They had a Labor federal government. The fundamental principles of the Labor Party could not be further from the measures put forward in this draconian bill. Labor does not support cuts to university funding and student support. Labor does not support a system of higher fees, bigger student debt, reduced access and greater inequality. And Labor does not believe that you should only have an opportunity to go to university if you are rich. When Labor was in government, we removed the caps on public university places. From 2009 to 2013, the number of Commonwealth-supported places went from 440,000 to 541,000. In my electorate, Acting Deputy Speaker, that saw an over 50% increase in the number of students attending university, a 48% increase in students from low socio-economic backgrounds. Under Labor, they had opportunity. Under this government, they are having the door shut in their face. Acting Deputy Speaker, the people of Lalor are rightly confused by a government that is ripping away our social compacts, that disregards the community benefit of the best and brightest attending university to ensure their contribution to our society, to our economy, is maximised, not just for their benefit, but for all. And Acting Deputy Speaker, we're hearing a lot about the international competition. We're hearing people say Australia's universities need to be able to compete. It's like the borders for tertiary education finish at the end of our island. They don't. One of the unforeseen things that could happen with this reform is that we might find more of our brightest and best studying overseas, more than they are now, and without any intention to return to make a contribution here. Deputy Speaker, I would finish with a question that I've put in this House a few times, and it's a question that young people have asked me to ask the Prime Minister. They want to know why some debt is so bad, but student debt is so good. I reject this bill and will firmly stand against it in this House.
I thank the member for Lalor.